last time we were discussing this advance of the American narrative throughout the world, looking at America in the 18th century and expanding based on the role and position of the American presidency. Just as a reminder, we really kind of began looking at the American nation as this expanding nation, this growing nation that has moved really from a very early nation in 1787 from 13 colonies that turned into 13 states into this nation that is really kind of a force to be reckoned with. The modern United States was kind of consolidated by 1900. And so we're going to see this kind of like nation that's going to emerge into the national scene from this kind of baby nation that really didn't have a lot of moving and shaking power in 1787 when they first consolidated. And so we're going to see consequences of this. Every territorial expansion, every kind of new kid on the block is going to cause some type of rippling effect in global politics. And so I left you off kind of leading into the 1900s and leading into the movings and shakings that the American expansion is going to cause in the global political scene. And sure enough, as the United States is growing and expanding, Europe is still fighting. Like I said in the last unit or in the last lecture, since the fall of Rome, Europe has had a set of issues that has caused continual conflict and turmoil in Europe. This kind of continues going on today. Brexit is an extension of this. Russia and Ukraine is an extension of this. A lot of Eastern European nations have been made and unmade, drawn and redrawn several times in the last 100 years because of this ongoing territorial kind of disputes that we're seeing in Europe. And inevitably, America is going to kind of have this perception of we're going to have to deal with this if for no other reason we have to exchange with it. We have to trade with it. We have to build commercial exchanges with it. It is our lifeline. We learned in the War of 1812 that trade with England and trade with Europe extensively is a huge component, is a huge lifeline of the American commercial investment. And so we can grow into the Pacific, but we have to get to a point where we're so involved in the Pacific, can we really kind of cut ties with England? And we're not there by the time we kind of see World War I break out. So the beginning of World War I is going to lead to a conflict between France and Germany, really. However, we blame it on other factors like the assassination of the Archduke, which honestly had nothing to do with World War I. It was the proverbial mama joke. This is what we do in wars. After the war, we're like, oh yeah, it was really that thing. Europe was a tinderbox of conflict based on political ideas and economic ideas, and those that accepted certain economic and political ideas and others that did not, and the discrepancies that begin to emerge and the arguments that flow from those discrepancies. It really is kind of interesting on looking at the turn of arguments and what is made during times of economic booms and economic crises. And so in World War I, we see, these economic issues, these economic forces really kind of playing into the politics. It's so interesting how much our political narrative follows our economic narrative. The problem is most voters don't really understand much about either one, but they really don't understand basic economics. We see this quite extensively. And so what happens is the American people going into World War I once again kind of echo Washington sentiment and say, we want to be isolationists. We do not want to get involved. We don't want to get our hands bloody. We don't want to get in the war. So stay out of it, stay out of it, stay out of it. The problem with staying out of the war is if Europe digresses into war, then all of the economic viability tied to Europe also goes away. You see a critical decrease in the number of jobs on the market, the number of finances on the market, the number of paychecks on the market. All of this fundamentally goes away when you look at Europe at war with each other. War is not profitable for the world. We have this understanding that it is, and it just isn't. War profits a very small group of people. Overwhelmingly, war is not profitable, and the greatest expansion of human success is done not during times of war, but actually during times of peace, during times of economic viability. So here Europe is once again going into war, once again fighting a traditional battle that has been waged since the fall of Rome. on territorial disputes, and for all intents and purposes, Germany is going to win World War One. Yes, I said it. By any measure of historic warfare, Germany wins World War One. They invade France. They secure their position in France. They secure the northern position. They dig trenches in the ground. France cannot do it. And at the end of this, they settle a ceasefire. So by the rules of historic European warfare, France should have lost that land and Germany should have won that land, which is why following the ceasefire, the armistice, Germany is going to march back into Berlin like conquering heroes. They believe they won the war. However, Germans do not get the spoils of the war because of what happens at the peace conferences following World War One. And if we don't get those spoils of the war, if the international coalition denies those spoils and leads to a peace conference that continues to deny those spoils, then you're going to have an economic tumult that's going to follow this kind of exchange that happens. And so unpacking World War One, first off, America is going to involve itself because, once again, a ship sunk. Remember, if you ever have an American history test and the question is, what prompted the U.S. involvement in any war, the correct answer is a boat sunk, rather. And so what America has done is we're in a bind because we don't want to get ourselves involved in the war. But if we don't get ourselves involved in the war, we lose economics. We lose commercial exchanges. We lose money. And so we're trying to figure out how do we involve ourselves in the war without ticking off one side or the other. If Europe is fighting, if we trade with one side, we're going to alienate the other side. We can't trade with both sides because then we're going to be seen as, greedy, money-handling traders, and that's never going to work out. And so if we trade with no one, if we become true isolationist, which again, isolationists never really seem to understand this, that if you break apart economically or break apart militarily, you also break apart economically. Those two are necessarily hand in hand. And so when we start looking at this, America is beginning to suffer an economic downturn during the war because of the loss of economic revenue. So we began to pack weapons and munitions in the bottom of travel vessels. And Germany knows what's going on. Once again, our best friend is Britain, so we are trading with Britain. These weapons and munitions are getting to the British forces. And Germany kind of looks at America and says, hey, Americans, we know what you're doing. Stop it. And America's like, what? We're just traveling. We want to come over there and see the war, which is kind of comical when you think about it. But we're like, no, we're not doing anything. And Germany says, no, we stop this. If you don't stop this, we are going to start sinking your boats. And America's like, no, you wouldn't sink these boats. These are innocent women and children, grandmas on these boats. And there's this kind of interesting thing on perception versus whatnot. If the American public is against the war, it makes it very difficult for the president to go to war. All right, guys, one of the biggest things that I thought was admirable about W. Bush is W. Bush stayed in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan despite the number of people and the number of voters that did not like that agreement, that did not like him for that. Barack Obama chose to stay in both wars despite the number of his own party members. In other words, there's something more that the president has to consider. But when a president is going into a war, considering foreign conflict, you have to keep the public in mind. And if the public says we don't want to go to war, then presidents are hard-pressed to make up that war. So if a president should happen to say, no, we're going to do this, I'm going to play brinkmanship because if it's successful, then I get economic viability and I preserve some type of economic phase. If it's unsuccessful and Germany actually sinks a passenger vessel, now I can sell it as an act of war, an act of aggression, and nothing pisses off Americans more like an act of aggression towards Americans. And so the Lusitania becomes this kind of line in the sand, this something where the president can simultaneously put himself in a win-win. He can either gain economic viability or he can gain the rationale, the reason to bring America into war. And so the Lusitania is going to bring America into World War I. Now, here's what's fascinating. At the end of World War I, after all of the arguments and councils and whatnot, This is, in my humble estimation, one of the most important events in global history. So much so that the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 ranks for me as one of the top 3 most critically important events in all of world history. World War I is so much more interesting than World War II. It's so much more critically moving than World War II. Like, World War II is the aftershock, it's the aftershow, it's the encore to everything that already happened in World War I. The problem is World War I just isn't as fun to study. It doesn't come with a lot of pizzazz. It doesn't come with a lot of extras. It doesn't come with the arguments of the Holocaust and mass genocide. And so we really don't study it very well. We end up studying World War II a lot more extensively. But in World War I, you see the American president kind of emerge, but he's not emerging as a more powerful entity. He's emerging as an equal entity, as an entity on equal standing with the world. So the world is looking at this, and Woodrow Wilson is stepping into the lion's den of European politics, not as the most powerful man in the world, but as just another politician from just another nation trying to figure out how we as the world are going to progress into the 20th and 21st century. And oddly enough, this is where I think one of the biggest discrepancies between the American role and the British role or English role or European role would actually play out. Woodrow Wilson fought vehemently for peace. He fought for a world that would recognize nations regardless of how size. In other words, he is going to lead with the idea that land doesn't matter, that the number of people, the amount of land does not matter, that the people matter, that every strategic political location, you have to trust the people on that a people in control of their own destiny tend to have more affirmation and more reasonable success in the creation and production of things than people that are suppressed under some other foreign entity. And so Wilson is going to argue this idea that says the world should not be constructed based on powerful nations getting more land and pulling that land into their power hordes, but rather the world should be constructed by the more powerful nations protecting the less powerful nations and letting every nation decide for themselves what they want to be. Well, how would we settle disputes? If we don't have the powerful nations fighting all the time, how do we settle disputes? Right? Woodrow Wilson said, well, we're going to create something. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees and political independence of territorial integrity to great and small states alike. In other words, what he calls his League of Nations. We are going to create a assembly of nations where every nation can petition a certain viable role, a certain representative element in global maneuverings and global changes and global exchanges. And this was going to be protected by the bigger nations, that we were going to all guarantee mutual guarantees. Right? Now, what this means is that your ability to be a nation should no longer be tied to your ability to protect your nation, but it was your ability to govern your nation, your ability to develop an economic basis, your ability to produce something and gain a viability into the World Economic Forum. And so Woodrow Wilson goes into the den of European politics and fights to get his League of Nations through. Now, he is fighting European politics that are 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years old. There is nothing new about the European political exchanges that are going to come out of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Everybody in Paris wants everybody in Germany dead. Everybody in Germany wants everybody in Paris dead. There are so many things that happen. I mean, literally, this is one of the most critically important events in human history. And here you have the President of the United States saying, hey guys, why don't we try something new? Why don't we try not fighting? Why don't we try guaranteeing a peace long enough where these smaller nations can actually produce something? Because if they're always running a risk of being conquered by bigger nations, then they can't ever produce or maximize the value of their people. Guys, this is capitalism. Right? This is capitalism as it's argued by Adam Smith. This is the very foundation of capitalism. Capitalism is going to assert that it is not land that matters, but rather the people that matter, that people construct their own wealth based on what they can produce, based on the viability of what they can produce. However, capitalism only works if you have a marketplace. Somebody has to secure the marketplace. Market, right? So if I have a buyer, all right, and I have a seller, we have to create a world where that buyer and seller can exist without threats of bombs or frustrations or mass shootings and all these kind of other stuff that would temporarily disrupt the marketplace. This is why every major global calamity disrupts the marketplace. COVID-19 disrupted the marketplace. Excuse me, right? When you look at the terrorist attack, 9/11 disrupted the marketplace. World War I disrupted the marketplace. When the marketplace is disrupted, everybody loses valuation. And so Woodrow Wilson, kind of taking on this understanding of marketplace economics, really is seeing the world as a world that needs to stop fighting these age-old, antiquated battles, and a world that needs to start understanding the dynamic power of an interconnected commercial world. So Woodrow Wilson goes to the world with this argument, makes this argument, and wins. In Europe, he wins. He finally gets France and Germany and all these people to, he has to give up a lot. There's a lot of stuff he has to compromise away, but he does get his League of Nations. He does get the ability of, instead of fighting in the future, let's actually wait. Let's sit back. Let's see what we can do diplomatically. Let's try just talking out the issues and finding in a global forum what is fair. The problem with Woodrow Wilson is this. He was not the popular election of the United States presidency. Remember, back in 1912, right, he was only elected because the Republican Party split their vote. Right, so the Republicans as a whole still have more viability, more backing, more popularity than Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson does win re-election in 1916, but most people chalk that winning of re-election in the we're in the middle of a war. A lot of the voters are gone, and the idea of switching a president in the middle of the war has never really been a great idea. That sat well in the American voters. And so we have this kind of conceptual reality that Woodrow Wilson is president primarily because the Republicans split the vote and we've been at war. In 1919, we're no longer at war, and going into the elections, the Democrats are once again kind of ramping up for an election, but they don't have the narratives that they need to in 1920. The Republicans are beginning to steal those narratives. The Republicans are beginning to build for the 1920 election, and part of that election means you cannot give Woodrow Wilson any successes. And so Woodrow Wilson goes in the den of European politics and negotiates global peace. Right, we had it. It was there. He negotiated. Europeans had agreed. Germany, France, Spain, the Middle East agreed to peace. But when the president of the United States brought that back to his own Senate, the political sentiments in America between the Republicans and Democrats ruined world peace. So Americans are complicated. Americans are this entity that tells the world simultaneously that we are for peace. We want peace. We desire peace. We want to be the peace-leading nation of the world. However, we are also critically responsible for the destruction or elimination of peace. Our own politicking at home can cause calamity across the globe without our real understanding of that, because when politics are controlled and Republicans and Democrats start going out of it, oftentimes we lose sight of the calamity that's caused because of that breakdown in decency here at home. Nobody understands this more than the men and women in Afghanistan that trust the United States to protect and defend them in the near future. And our politics has grown to be critically important in the world, and until we realize this, we're going to see a destabilizing world. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, even though you may not have liked him on 500 different things and may not have agreed with him on 500 different things, he did negotiate a path towards peace. But that path toward peace was undermined by his own Senate. When Woodrow Wilson brought the League of Nations back to the United States, it was his own Senate that rejected it. And then the world, looking at this one, looking at Woodrow Wilson, looking at the U.S. president, they looked at us and said, if your own government thinks the League of Nations is a bad idea, why would we do it? Why would we submit? After the Senate rejects the League of Nations, it limps on for a couple more years, but it ultimately breaks down. After the breakdown of the League of Nations, the world falls into economic calamity. Why? Because everybody goes in defensive. Everybody starts going isolationist. This is one of the biggest things about isolationism. COVID-19 did the same thing. Let's close our borders. Let's shut everything down. Once you have produced an economically interconnected world, if you shut your borders down, you cut yourself off from the economic inflows and outflows of those commercial exchanges. So what happens following World War I is mass distrust throughout the world. People close their borders, people shut down, and the economic consequences of that shutting down led to a global depression, not just in the United States, but throughout the globe. Now, the United States, it was a Dust Bowl and some other stuff, and yeah, these were contributing factors of it, but all in all, it wasn't just the Dust Bowl that caused the American Great Depression. There are larger geopolitical forces that are happening in the world that causes a global depression. And nobody saw it harder than Eastern Europe. Once again, you have to keep this in mind because so many political ideas are connected to economic ideas. There is a reason that Karl Marx's ideas of communism and equity, are most popular in Eastern Europe. They were the places that were hit hardest by the economic depression in the 1930s. We're looking at less than 100 years ago. And so these economic discrepancies lead to certain political ideas. And those political ideas we have to reconcile on a global setting. And so Woodrow Wilson goes into the globe and wins this argument of peace, but then loses it at home. And because he loses at home, we almost inevitably guarantee another conflict. Once again, World War II emerges as a battle between the United States and the rest of the world to so many ways. Now, the United States is fighting not just in Europe, but we're fighting the Pacific as well. We're fighting a two-war front because Germany's going to ally with Japan, because honestly, Japan is trying to do what the United States did. They're trying to do what Britain did. They're trying to take a smaller nation and build a global empire from a kind of small capital nation. But Japan is doing it more of the old school way, through domination, through tyranny, through mass violence. What Japan does in China still to this day has not been forgiven. The rape of Nanking is one of the most storied abuses in all of Chinese history. And so when you start looking at what Japan's doing in the Pacific, Japan is taking a page out of a more traditional kind of narrative, that you build a strong navy, you build a strong army, you invade, you conquer and destroy, and you force nations to your will. Well, Japan is expanding in the Pacific, but so is the Americans, or so are the Americans rather. And so that's inevitably going to put the Americans in battle with Japanese. Like I said on the last lecture, the biggest argument we fought in World War II was the argument in the Pacific, the war between us and the Japanese. For all intents and purposes, we didn't have a lot of battles to fight in Europe, but we needed the Europeans to ally with us so we can actually begin suppressing some of these geopolitical movements throughout the world, because Japan does ally with Germany. And so we are necessarily brought into a global conflict. Now, once again, we did what Americans do. At the beginning of this conflict, we sat back and said, no. We don't want to fight. We don't want to involve ourselves. We want to remain neutral. We want to stay isolated. It's not our fight. We're not the policemen of the world. We have heard that predictably throughout American history. Wash our hands of it. We don't want it. But remember, if you stay out of the war militarily, you stay out of it economically. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is in a conundrum because the public does not want him to go to war. However, America is suffering the economic consequences of the last war and the economic downturn of a global depression. And so FDR is in a situation, right? He either has to turn American sentiment in favor of American entry of the war, or he has to suffer the consequences of a continued downturn in the economy. And so what we have is we end up with an argument to enter the war. December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. And guys, it's not astronomically to say that Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been accused by several prominent members of American history for kind of leaving Pearl Harbor as setting ducks. There's a lot of conspiracy theories that center on Pearl Harbor, really asking, did the president actually let this happen? Now, did he plan it? No. But there are evidence that suggests that top admirals in the U.S. Navy at the time requested movement, said this was not a good idea, that argue we didn't lose the Japanese fleet. But there's a war here between what happens politically at home and what happens economically in the world. And presidents have to suffer that type of dichotomy between public opinion and right foreign action. And so I'm not saying that FDR did have a say in this. I'm not saying he did cause this, but I'm saying that you cannot understand Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency without understanding the dynamic shift in public opinion that Pearl Harbor had, not just for the American sentiment of World War II, but also for the American sentiment towards our president, our leader during that war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so when we look at the World War II, we don't get it. We buy in this isolationist thing, and arguably we do this until we are attacked. Japan is going to attack us. The famous quote that I fear of the Japanese admiral at the time says, "I fear all we've done is waken a sleeping giant." And they were right. Americans go to war, and not just militarily, but we go to war in every way you can possibly go to war. We turn our factories into war machines. We turn everything. Our economy burst back into action because we pick a side and we went to war. We went to war with Japan on one side, we went to war with Germany on the other. And we scientifically went to war. We actually advanced nuclear technology to blow up atoms. There's one called fusion and one called fission. Fusion is when you force two hydrogens together. Fission is when you break them apart. But immense amounts of energy are released when we start playing with atomic chemistry. This was actually presented in the new movie Oppenheimer, which is actually a kind of a brilliant understanding of just the power that we can release with this. But here's the point of the narrative here. America has this power and nobody else does. So as we wrap up World War II, we're not wrapping up World War II the way we wrapped up World War I, where the president was on equal standing with the world. We're wrapping up World War II, where America is now the undisputed most powerful nation on the planet. And our president is now the most powerful, undisputed leader of the world. Why? Because we have the biggest bombs, right? So we have the previous kind of president in Woodrow Wilson saying the president needs to be a moral leader. The president needs to be a leader of peace. The president needs to be a leader of diplomacy and conversation. But all of those kind of finer points of diplomacy and conversation failed in his own nation. He couldn't even get that through his own Senate. And so the new American president does something different. I'm going to be a peace through strength. We think Ronald Reagan, ironically, this notion of Ronald Reagan coming up with peace through strength. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is arguably the first real United States president that was president of peace through strength. We are the most powerful because we have the most weapons, and we have the biggest guns, and we have the biggest bombs. And so America is going to kind of gain this power, but once again, simply having the power doesn't make America bad. It's what America does with that power. But it does require us as students of history and the American presidency to steward what exactly we're doing with that power. Because if we do have the power today to destroy our world, which yes, we do, we have enough nuclear capability today to eliminate every man, woman, and child off of the planet. We effectively could destroy our planet. This is something we have the power to do with the push of the button, something we have not had historically. And so when you start looking at the power given to the United States president and world leaders, right, we give somebody this power based on his opinion on whether or not a woman should have an abortion, based on his opinion on whether or not two men should be able to get married, based on his opinion on whether or not we should have public funded schools or privately funded schools. In my humble estimation, this right here should occupy the president's thoughts and attention more than anything else he does. He has to make peace or war. And the reality of war today is so much more consequential than the reality of war historically, which is why World War I was the most calamitous event at that time, leading to World War II being the most calamitous event. And after that, we kind of stopped fighting with the bigger nations. We sat back and said, well, maybe we don't fight. Maybe we enter into a Cold War where all the bigger nations don't fight each other. And so we tried to realize the calamity of fighting all the time and then say, well, maybe it's better if we don't fight. So in order to not fight, let's come up with a diplomatic organization. Let's come up with a diplomatic organization where all nations can come and talk peace, or quote-unquote League of Nations 2.0. The problem is we didn't actually balance the United Nations. The United Nations only survived because those winning World War II gave themselves an absolute position in the United Nations where they would basically be able to control everything else. Not just protect, but control. And not all of them control for the same reason. If the United States, UK, and Russia are all on the same, what we call the Security Council, which has an absolute veto power in the United Nations, what happens when Russia and the United States have discrepancy? There's no way to balance that out. What happens when China and the United States have a discrepancy? There's no organization that can settle that dispute because all of them have this kind of absolute veto power. Now, if we involved all these other nations could help navigate some of the disputes between the bigger nations. But the way the United States or United Nations was constructed, they simply do not have that authority. So we put forth this kind of group, this United Nations, that effectively becomes a toothless organization that really is more comical than anything else. It becomes kind of like a global charity organization than a global force for peace. Well, in the absence of a global force for peace, we have another kind of argument emerge following World War II, and that's the argument between what we call NATO nations, or what I would consider more Republican, capitalist-friendly nations, and the Warsaw Pact nations, or Soviet nations, or what we'd consider communist nations. Now, I don't have time to go into here. It's not really communism, and it's not really capitalism. It's a mixed modified capitalism, and it's not really communism. But what I will say is this, that remember, economics has a lot to do with politics. And so the most war-torn nations of Europe, the most impoverished nations, gravitate to an argument initially that leads to this kind of promise of equitability that is at the root of Karl Marx's argument of communism. Now, most people don't understand the argument. Most people have never read Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto. But this idea of economic wealth kind of similarity of wealth equality is very, very powerful with those who have the most economic trouble. However, the more prosperous individuals tend to rely on a different argument. And so based on kind of your economics following the war, we kind of broke the world into two sects. Now, we needed a clear divide, so we called that divide democracy versus communism. That's in name only. We're not a real democracy. They're not a real communism, but in name only. We have United States and its allies and Russia and their allies, and we engage in kind of what we call a Cold War, proxy wars, wars across the world that kind of settle on these arguments on what are we going to do moving forward. And the Truman Doctrine, once again named after our president, 1947, following FDR's death, We see Truman kind of become president of the United States before Eisenhower wins the next election. And in 1947, Truman declared that the U.S. would assist nations threatened by geopolitical expansion of the Soviet Union. So once again, the president is going to remain a critical component of global affairs, not just national affairs anymore, but global affairs now. The United States is no longer a spokesperson of a nation. He is a spokesperson of the world. And when we start looking at Western European recovery, the American, through the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, we dump a lot of money into Europe. We rebuild Europe. And this is something I don't think we fundamentally understand. I have a lot of old timers in the United States that remember the booming economy of the 50s in the United States, the booming economy of the 60s. Well, the booming economy of the 50s and 60s made sense because America was one of the few producers in the world. Most of Europe had been ransacked. If you think about even automakers, most of your automakers and factories were completely obliterated in World War II. The only nation producing a sizable number of automobiles at this time was America. So because we were the only lemonade stand on the block, we had kind of license to do what we want. And we then, even though we had that, we still went into Europe and helped rebuild their factories, rebuild their roads. We helped rebuild the competition. And so there's something to this of saying that America does actually try to pursue peace. When we look at the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and the way Eisenhower kind of goes about conducting the world, we see American presidents, in essence, trying to help rebuild our competitors, which means we don't see them as competitors. We see them as assets. We see them as members of a global coalition of economics. Now, if we're going to go from the 50s to today, it means that we have to keep up. We have to develop an economic system that can manage the growing and moving and shakings of the world. And this is something that, once again, the president is, hit between popular sentiment with his voters and the reality of the world. So a lot of people want to blame today that the, American economy is suffering because of this or that, whatnot. The American economy today is a wide open, vibrant economy. But the problem is that the jobs that are opening today are not jobs that many of the old timers losing their job are qualified to take. They're more high tech jobs. They're different type of jobs. They're computer jobs. They're engineering jobs. And so the moving and shaking of the forces as we rebuild the world, this is going to cause an endless kind of movement of jobs that's necessary for us to keep up, which sometimes can hurt the president and his political opinion polls. And so when we start looking at this, the central question of America in the modern world has America become an empire concerned with global control to ensure its own benefit and survival, or has America assumed the role of ensuring global peace and does so at its own expense? I would argue that neither side has a lot of concreteness. I think it's a bit of both. That capitalism argues that yes, if I have a capitalistic system, then it's about building economic exchanges. But if I build an economic exchange with another human being, then yeah, I can build that marketplace to benefit this human being, and this human being can gain wealth and stability from the marketplace. But if he contributes back to the marketplace, then I also gain. And so when we start looking at, did America exploit the world? Did America help the world? It's not that simple. America simultaneously opened up a marketplace for the world to engage in, yes, and does so based on basically footing the bill for global peace and security of commercial exchange routes. But in response for that, we get all kinds of stuff. There's no shortage of stuff in America. If you go to the basic grocery store, like I said in the last lecture, go to Target and find me something made in America. And even if you go to something made in America like ice cream or food, a lot of your ice creams are novelty ice creams like Madagascar vanilla ice cream, or we pull from exotic fruits or mango and and we have avocado oil on our shelves. These are all kind of commodities that require a global trade. Nowhere in the world do you have the sheer breadth of choices that you can buy like you have in America. And America has really accentuated this element of you can walk to almost any American grocery store and you have far more choices for ice cream alone than other nations have in their entire produce section. And yet, Americans do not seem to understand that connection, that it's not simply about exploiting the world, it's about creating a context, creating a situation where, yes, Americans benefit from the wealth of stuff coming into America, the opportunities of supplies and whatnot, but also we give money, supplies, and securities to developing nations. And so if this is the case, then we have to make the argument. We have to say, is America a force for good overall? Yeah, we've benefited, right? Yes, we've given. But so overall, what do the stats produce? In the wake of Assad bombing his own hospital, this image was erected by an Islamic artist, a Syrian artist rather. It says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." Why does the world, if America's so bad, why does the world still tend to look at America as the image of hope, as the image of sanctuary? And this is something that I think we have to wrap our minds around, right? William Robertson, which was the 18th century Scottish historian, once argued in his book, How Scotland Invented the Modern World. He says, commerce tends to wear off those prejudices which maintain distinctions and animosity between nations. It softens and polishes the manner of men. It unites them by one of the strongest of all ties, the desiring of supplying their mutual wants. It disposes them to peace by establishing in every state an order of citizens bound by their interest to be the guardians of public tranquility. As soon as the commercial spirit gains an ascendant in any society, we discover a new genius in its policy, its alliances, its wars, and its negotiation. Notice, it is not strength that guarantees peace. It's the commercial interconnectedness of things. Once we become interconnected with other people, once we have a general kind of give and take, once we become dependent on others, it is that mutual dependency that forces us to be a bit more tactful in our policy, a bit more tactful in our alliances, a bit more cautious of our wars, and a bit more careful in our negotiations. Because if we have something to lose when we go to war, then we think twice before we go to war. If we say, no, America has everything we need, we can be isolationist, close the borders, we're done, we're complete. Now, that hyper-individualism is the foundation of all war. Yes, we've argued this from the get-go, right? This whole notion of American independence, hyper-independence, independence, I'm me, I get to do whatever I want, that is the critically misunderstood component of all war. If you think you are sufficient in and of yourself, then you tend not to rely on others. You tend not to depend on others. You tend not to look at others as assets. Therefore, other people are dispensable things in the world that is you. And it causes a foundation. If I believe that there are things in this world that I cannot obtain without somebody else's help, now I have to orient myself in such a way to gain their affirmation, to gain their trust, and to gain their alliance and their help. This is effectively what is going to emerge in the Western system, and it is this sentiment that is going to take hold in America. Well, does it work? If we look at the share of the world living in absolute poverty, you could argue that it works. 1940, this is World War II, and we do see a general decline. From the 1820s, we are seeing a decline in the world based on the share of the world living in absolute poverty. We're seeing a decline. Even at the beginning of World War II, look at this, 72% of the world was living in poverty, 55% living in extreme poverty. America takes over at the end of World War II, and what happens? We see this trend go down even more precipitously, right? To the point where today, the number of people projected to live in abject poverty or absolute poverty is among the lowest of any time historically. So has this commercial investment thing, has this argument of trust nations, bring nations into the economic forum, bring nations into a commercial exchange, has it worked? From a stats point of view, from a data point of view, it does seem to have worked. We do see more nations economically prosperous today than at any time in history. And I think this is something that we kind of have to reconcile with. If we say America is only a force for evil, that America is only concerned with their own wealth, we have seen a global kind of push towards more power, more strength, and more money for more people. We've also seen a dynamic decrease in the number of deaths in the world. Outside of spikes in certain wars, Vietnam is here. When you get into Indochina there, you see a little bit of the Middle East spike here, but you're still only looking at a relatively small number of deaths on a given year. But most of this, if we look at following these kind of hiccups, most of the modern world is on a general decline of less and less death, less and less outright conflict. To those people out there saying that war is profitable and war profits most people, that is foundationally, academically, and by the data incorrect. War profits only those who profit from war, and that's a very small percentage of individuals and companies. Overwhelmingly, the majority of the world profits from peace, profits from interdependency, profits from a lack of pure independence. The other thing is, during times of peace, we see more governments lean on trusting, right thing. Now, democracy here is any government that has some sort of public involvement. It's kind of complicated because we haven't really defined democracy very well, because what we call democracy is not democracy. But again, I don't have time to fight that battle. So for our purposes here, we're saying if I have a government that is a Hobbesian government that requires everybody to give in to one sovereign, and then I have another government that is a Lockean government that allows people to have some say, right, in the mechanisms of their government and guaranteed rights, right? So guaranteed rights, right? Remember, Rousseau would be over here, Rousseau, all right? Rousseau would be here because there are no guaranteed rights in communism, right? So Rousseau and Hobbes are two sides of the same impressive coin. Locke guarantees rights. So any government that guarantees rights to the people, we have called democracy this one. Any kind of government that guarantees rights and give people some say. Notice what happens in the 1900s. We are seeing it on the decline until World War I. All right, World War I, because you lose trust. You cannot give rights unless you have some type of trust in each other and other nations. After that, we cause a decline. This decline following World War I leads to what? Economic cutoff of the world, and it leads to a global depression, right? We then, following World War II, we began developing this thing, and we kind of capsize where the world is at a question mark. Are we going to do this? Is this thing that guarantees rights and guarantees economic interexchanges, is it going to be successful? And even though we see this period, this time period here of question mark, overwhelmingly it does seem that the world did kind of buy into this and say, you know what, we're going to follow America's lead. We're going to see this until recently. Recently, with the American destabilization, with the American pullout of Iraq and Afghanistan, with the American failure to negotiate effectively in Russia and to protect nations like Ukraine from the threats of larger nations, this recent calamity in our foreign policy led by our recent presidents has caused the world to kind of rethink this, and we have actually seen this number continue to decline. And so the question is, where will we go from here? And the where we go from here is completely dependent on our elections. What we do here and the politicking of our elections at home between the Republicans and Democrats, and even the perversions of the Republicans and Democrats, that doesn't just carry consequences for our nation, it carries consequences for the entire world. So when you go to the polls and you just cast a vote for Republican or Democrat, you have to be cognizant that you're not just casting a vote for an American political party, you're you're literally casting a vote that will mean life and death for thousands of human beings across the globe. That vote carries so much more significance than the candidates really allow it to, and then the voters understand. And a couple more lectures on the modern president, one more next week. Won't be as in-depth as these last two. Hopefully you've gotten something out of this. Like I said, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know. Send me your thoughts and messages. But like I said, this is where the art of the presidency, where the presidency, really building a presidency of 13 ragtag colonies, is now the presidency of arguably the most powerful person in the world. And as much as the Electoral College was necessary to make sure that Washington was the most upright, most honorable individual, I would argue the Electoral College is even more necessary today, as the modern president needs to be even more upright, more trustworthy, more tactful, more intelligent, more qualified than even what we would see in a George Washington. And I bid you all adieu. I will see you next time.